Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how likely it is that the materials, the skills, the procedures that you learned in training will be actually taken back to the job and used regularly. Um, it's all great and good to sit in on a training session that you completely can understand and apply the techniques in the training session, but then you go back to work and it's business as usual, or you're completely confused and all that stuff you learned in training doesn't make sense now that you're back here in your job situation. Um, there are two kinds of transfer. There's positive transfer, which is where your performance actually is better after you've experienced training. And then there's negative transfer, where you actually are worse off after training than you were before training, which is definitely not the goal, right? We're looking for positive transfer, where after you've been trained, you do better on the job. So how do we ensure that you will experience positive transfer of training? Well, identical elements theory tells us that one way to ensure positive transfer will be to maximize the similarity between the training situation and the job situation. So, you can run the full gamut from, a person who's working at a fast food restaurant taking orders to, a firefighter learning how to put out fires to an executive that you're hiring. All of these, you can sort of look at ways that a person could be trained in realistic ways that would help them to do well on the job. And the more realistic, the more like the real job, according to this theory, the more likely that training is going to transfer into this situation. One thing that will boost the likelihood that the information will transfer is if the learner is given the opportunity to actively practice the materials. So trainings that involve workshops and hands-on activities and actually going through mock interviews or customer service experiences where you've got the disgruntled customer who calls and it's a pretend call, but you've got a set of things happening on the phone that's very like what would happen in real life, that kind of thing. That kind of active practice helps to ensure that what you're learning in training will transfer to the real world. And then another thing is to allow the learners to practice in different contexts. It's one thing to be sitting in a classroom that has been, your training locale and practice with your classmates and then say, yes, I understand, and this is what I'll do in the real world. It's a whole other thing to practice it in the classroom and then go into a version that looks like the real workplace but has maybe pretend customers there, or pretend, let's say, if you're familiar with, like, if you wanted to become a K through 12 teacher, you have to do your teaching practice year. One of the first steps in your teaching practice year is to have pretend students, and it's a classroom, and you're provided with questions that you have to answer like a student would ask you, and you have to administer tests and things like that. But these are people who aren't really supposed to be learning from you. You're learning from them. Then you go to the next level where you actually start to work with real students, but under the guidance of another teacher, and so on. And different contexts where you get to practice different skills with more and more responsibility is a great example of the situation where you'll have transfer of training. Transfer climate refers to whether where you're going to go actually do the work is very supportive of you using things that you learned in training. I don't know if you guys have ever had an experience where you've learned something new at a training that you were sanctioned or sent to. It might be a training that you volunteered for, and then you come back with all this new information, or maybe the company sent you there. One way or another, you come back with all this new information, and sometimes people will respond to you as though they don't want to change based on what you're telling them that you learned at training. That's not the greatest thing. Instead, what we want is an ongoing collaboration going on between the trainee and their trainers, A lot of times when you've gone through training, you're given the contact information for your trainer so that if you need a refresher or a reminder, or maybe now that you're on the job, you're not exactly sure if you're interpreting this situation through the lens of what you were trained. And so you can call the trainer and ask them or email them or whatever. And then also the collaboration between the trainee and the manager so that it doesn't feel like the manager is necessarily like defensive about what the trainee has brought back. The trainee feels supported in their learning, stuff like that. And then also a collaboration between the trainers and the managers so that the managers feel like the trainers are actually teaching the trainees things that the managers want them to know and need them to know, right? Everybody needs to feel like this training strategy is supportive of the job, not a threat to anybody's ego and any of those kinds of things. And then, of course, clear expectations for everybody up front will help with the transfer of training. So if it's clear that the trainee is expected to come back with new information and share it with the group, that's going to make it a lot easier for the group to accept that the trainee is coming back with new information and they're all supposed to be learning from it. Those kinds of things up front, like what is the goal? Why are we sending you to this training? Those kinds of things being outlined up front is the best strategy. And then on-the-job maintenance. Now that you're back to work, let's maintain those new behaviors that you learned at training. And let's encourage you for those things. Let's give you practice on the job. If it's sometimes we've been trained to do things that are not necessary to express every day at work. And so sometimes you need to refresh your training because you haven't seen a customer or a patient or somebody with that circumstance in a while. So maybe you need to do some kind of maintenance to remind yourself what you were trained. All of those things are part of the transfer climate. The more supportive the transfer climate is, the more likely that the learner is to bring the training information back to work and display positive transfer. Now, there was a meta-analysis conducted by Bloom and colleagues in 2010, and they assessed all of these factors and try to figure out what was most important in the positive transfer of training in the real world, not just sort of theoretically, but in the real world. And what they found is that, first of all, the transfer climate was one of the main factors in whether the training positively transferred into the workplace. So the meta-analysis recommended that everybody has to be on the same page when people get trained so that there isn't all that ego and concern about, are you usurping my authority or any of those kinds of things going on. The transfer climate needs to be supportive. And then also there are certain factors in the trainee that boost the positive transfer. Whether the trainee is high in conscientiousness, they're much more likely to learn from the training and then to apply it. Cognitive ability, those who have the cognitive capability to learn in the training session and then generalize to situations that might not be perfectly analogous to the training situation, but are close enough to be an appropriate time to implement the thing that they learned in training. You got to have some cognitive ability to make those connections. And so cognitive ability is a factor. And then also, did they voluntarily participate in the training or were they sent to training? If they voluntarily participated, it's much more likely that the training will transfer to work. If they were sent there, they may not have been very motivated during learning, and they may not really feel like changing their behavior at work. And so the training may not transfer. So those are all factors that the meta-analysis conducted by Bloom and colleagues found are really important for positive transfer. Okay, let's go ahead and stop here, and I'll come back in the next section and talk about how we can deliver information in training.